welcome to states of transactions. There are 5 states in transaction. So see from this diagram, 5 states. So one is active state, partially committed, committed state, failed, terminated. Okay. So just to try to understand from this picture. So previous class, so we discussed what is beginning of the transaction. Here database is consistent. So then end of the transaction is terminated. Here also the database is consistent. Once a date beginning of the transaction or starts execution, it becomes active. Here it performs, it can issue a read or write operations. Okay, so try to understand. So once a transaction states execution, it becomes active. So that means it can issue read or write operation. Once the read and write operations complete, the transaction becomes partially committed state. Okay, so when this transaction becomes partially committed state, so once the read and write operations completed, so then we can say the state of this transaction is partially committed. Next, if there is some recovery protocols need to ensure that the system failure will not result an inability to record changes the transactions permanently. So if this check is a success, the transaction commits and enters into the committed state. Okay, so previously we discussed, okay, once it starts the execution completed successfully, so then the outcome of the transaction is committed. Okay, that means all the changes, updates, okay, saved permanently in the database or in the disk. Okay, so that is committed. If other than committed, if there is any problem occurs, suppose example you can take power failure after performing some of the statements execution, so then, so what happens? So then it is the situation, the state is called failed state. Okay, so try to understand if there is any problem, okay, at the partially committed state or when it is an active state, okay, so then it goes to the failed state. Okay, once it is failed means we have to leave the transaction with rollback statement. That means rollback will reject whatever the updates before the failure, any statements executed. If there are any updates, those all updates are rejected and it keeps the old values same. Okay, so that is the use of a rollback. Okay, so here you try to understand. So when this failed state will become the failed state. Okay, if all the instructions are executed successfully, so it converts from active state to partially committed to committed. So once it is committed, all the results are saved in database. So then we want to leave the transaction, that is called terminate the transaction. Okay, so this is one process, and next process is if the transaction is aborted at active state or aborted at partially committed state, so then this transaction goes to the failed state. Okay, so this transaction should be rolled back to undo the effect of its write operations on the database. Okay, so here it should be rolled back to the undo operations. So that previously I explained. If there is any updates happened before the failed state, okay, these statements rejects by rollback SQL statement. Okay, then it uses the same value. What are the value presents at the beginning of the transaction? That value must be in that variable. So that is called rollback. Okay, after failed state, so we want to terminate this transaction, then it goes to the terminated active state. So these are the 5 states. So very important. I hope all of you understand the states of transaction. So see here, these are the 5 states: active state, okay, and partially committed state, okay, committed state, failed state, terminated state. Okay, so I explained you. So when it is in active state, so it starts execution. The transaction is in active state. It performs a read and write operations. Once it performs a read and write operations on the database, so here we can say the transaction is partially committed. Okay, so then here we need some recovery protocols to ensure that if there is a system failure or it is aborted, so then we will go to the failed state, and here it uses the rollback mechanism. So what is meant by rollback mechanism? So here it is a rollback mechanism means before the failed state, if there is any updates, that updates must be rejects and changes, rejects the changes, okay, before the failed state, and it revoke the old values. Okay, this is called rollback situation. If it is executed successfully, so partially committed state to committed state, that means all the updates changed in database permanently. So this is committed. Once it is committed, then we want to leave this transaction. So that's why we want to go for terminated state. Okay, so we want to leave that transaction and we will go for another transaction. So this is called states of transactions.